Hello and welcome to Series 3 of The Life of Letters. I'm Laura Edralin, your host and London-based calligrapher, curious about the history and future of letters. This season, we're diving back into the rich world of scripts, letter forms, and the stories behind the marks we make on paper and elsewhere. A massive thank you to Speedball for sponsoring this season of the podcast. It really means so much to us. Not only do we have their Director of Product Marketing, Melissa, joining me for an episode this season, but I've been using Speedball tools since my very early days of calligraphy, so their support truly means the world. Enjoy the episode, and if you want to find out more about the guest, the podcast, or me, please check out the show notes. In today's episode, I'm delighted to be speaking with Paul Antonio. As a calligrapher and heraldic artist, Paul's work focuses on an in-depth study into letter forms, both from a paleographical and a geometric perspective. He is also the author of Copperplate Script, a yin and yang approach, possibly best known online as Pascribe. Is that correct?
So it's a PA scribe.
PA Scribe. Paul runs his calligraphy business from Portugal as an artist, but also selling everything online, from digital and physical products to workshops, free resources and communities supporting calligraphy journeys all around the world. Paul, firstly, a huge welcome to the Life of Letters podcast. I'm so excited to be talking to you today.
Thanks so much, Laura. Thanks so much for asking me to come on.
It's so good. It's so lovely speaking to people all over the world, and especially you, because I've been following your incredible Instagram content, and we're going to go through some of the stuff that you share on there. But I wondered whether you can kind of begin by explaining where your interest in calligraphy and letters came from.
So, I grew up in Trinidad, and we have such amazing nature in Trinidad. And I grew up spending a lot of time outdoors. And I love plants and animals. And growing up, my brother and I, we kept busy doing things, and we would trace letters and fill them in with just like a ballpoint pen. And then one day he came home and he had done this Old English alphabet. And I said, wow, what is this? And he said, some new letters that I've discovered. And I was looking at it and I said to him, so I'm about 9 here. And I said to him, yeah, but if you had a big pen, you could just make the lines, right? And he said, what do you mean? And I don't know how I could see this. And so he said, just remember, draw the outline and fill it in. And I'm like, but if you had a big pen, you could just... I didn't know what I was talking about. And then a couple of weeks later, a friend of mine said to me, oh, Paul, my mom bought me this set. It's called a calligraphy set. I was like, oh, what's that? He said, yeah, it's really hard to use. And as you like writing, I thought maybe you might like it. And so I was like, oh, okay. So I went over to see him. And as soon as I saw it, I went, oh, a big pen!
This is it. This is what I meant.
And I got hooked, and I just fell in love with it. And of course, Mummy would take us to the museum, and I would always notice at the bottom of the botanical and wildlife illustrations, this really beautiful script. And on the maps, you had these lovely cartouches filled with flourishing and different types of scripts. And I was fascinated with letters, and it just started as a child, and I stuck with it. And then I went on to teach at secondary school. I taught at the boys' Catholic school, and I started to focus on the boys' handwriting. And so I ended up running remedial classes in the evenings after school from like 3 to 5 for boys who were really struggling with their handwriting. And I was doing bits of calligraphy work in Trinidad for like large corporations. So I sort of, it's always been in my life. It's always been a big part of my life. And of course, I'm a quarter Chinese as well. So I grew up seeing and interacting with a lot of Chinese script. And I was always fascinated that writing was not just these letters that we used. There were other characters that conveyed meaning, but I didn't know what they were saying because we didn't learn Mandarin at home. My great-grandparents didn't want us to learn to speak Mandarin. They wanted us to integrate into sort of Trinidadian life. But we grew up seeing this around us. So writing for me has always been really quite fascinating. And, my mom raised the four of us on our own, and we were very well-behaved kids. And she would take us to the library. And eventually we got to the point where we knew how to deal with the library, and we would be very quiet. And so the librarian eventually said to her, if you want to leave them here, they're very well behaved. They're not going to cause trouble. You can go off and do things. And I remember looking up this word on the box, calligraphy, in Encyclopedia Britannica. And that full range of encyclopedia set that, you never had one at home because it was so expensive. When I did really well at school, and Mommy said to me, "What would you like as your present?" And I said, "I would love a set of encyclopedia." And she paid every month. She bought a book. So she started with A, and then every month this book would come, and I'd be like, oh, my whole life would change. And so I was in the library. I must have been about 10. And I remember looking up calligraphy. And at the end of the section, it said, C, paleography, Egyptian hieroglyphs, blah, blah, blah. And it sort of listed, where the next rabbit hole would be. And I was like, oh, what are Egyptian hieroglyphs? And I remember going to the E section and getting the book off the shelf and opening it and looking for Egyptian. I have goosebumps all over me. And I opened it and I was like, what is this? Oh my God, this is writing? These are pictures? And my mind it was on fire. And so I went to the librarian and I said, oh, what stuff do you have on Egypt? And she was like, well, how did you find Egypt? I said, here. And she was great. She was like, wow, this child. And so she gave me a little section of a big table, and she brought books out on Egypt. And I remember just standing there looking down at about 10 books. And she was standing right there. And I was like, what is Egypt? And I remember walking home and I was like, Egypt, hieroglyphs, and oh gods, and Osiris. And my mommy was like, what is wrong with you? And Egypt and Egyptian hieroglyphs played a really big part of my life until I was about 12. And I thought, I'm growing up in a developing country. I will never leave Trinidad. I will never get to Egypt. And so I sort of gave away all my books on Egypt, which I'd been buying and saving my money and doing chores for other people and earning money to buy books. And, years later, I ended up working in a pyramid drawing hieroglyphs for the Metropolitan Museum in Egypt. It was just like, oh, it was amazing. So writing for me is not just about these Latin letters that we produce. And it's also about the numbers. When I look at writing, I think of these marks that we make, which convey meaning. And they don't necessarily have to be numbers, or they don't necessarily have to be letters. And then the numbers have their own magical path, where they evolved from. And, these are Arabic numbers that came from India via Arabia, via the Arabian Quarter. And, it's 1, 2, 3, 4. It's because of the number of angles in the lines. And you're just like, what? And that's fascinating because they too convey meaning. And then, as I got older, I started getting into non-Latin scripts. Now, of course, things like writing in French is the same set of characters, and then you have diacritics. But then you go to German, and you have another set of diacritics, and I love that.
What's diacritics?
The marks that you find on top of letters.
Like the accents and
like
umlauts
accents
and things
and cedulars and umlauts and these things that help to alter the sound of the letter. But even simple things like diagraphs, where you have like an A conjoined, and that's a technical construct when you're writing. And so for me, it's just, how do these things, these marks, convey meaning? Mm-hmm. And even going as far back as sort of 60,000 BC, when you find these markings on caves and finger fluting. For years, they just thought they were patterns. Archaeologists, in the last sort of 15 years have been saying that this is a simplified form of communication. That's writing as well.
Yeah.
So when you think about cavemen, you're like, oh yeah, they had no writing, and they did. we're just not able to decipher it. And for me, it's all of that. Calligraphy is a tiny part of that. You have calligraphy, epigraphy, paleography, hieroglyphic writing, Hittite hieroglyphs, Hurrian hieroglyphs, Mayan hieroglyphs, Egyptian hieroglyphs, Aztec hieroglyphs. It's just phenomenal how much there is to connect these crazy little marks that convey meaning.
Yeah. And the beauty of the world of it. I mean, it's endless, isn't it? Like you found the spiral of, right, I've gone down this rabbit hole, but then there's all of this and I get to find out all of
You're like,
this.
oh, the other rabbit holes.
It's endless. I mean, it's fascinating and such a vast history, which really comes back to kind of that communication and language and all the things that kind of bring us all together, which is a lovely thing to be able to do and to produce and to explore as artists. I had to Google it, but can you explain what a heraldic artist is and what does that mean in your work?
So when I left Trinidad, I moved to England and I won a scholarship to study letterform history at Reading. And Reading really changed my life. And I met some great people like James Mosley, Michael Harvey, and the faculty at Reading. And, I was like, oh, why are we using fonts? If you want to write something beautifully, you should use calligraphy. And I learned very early on at Reading that there is a purpose for every type of writing, every type of letter system. And I started to accept that fonts were really an important part of our lives. And then I left, I finished my year there. It was a year-long course. And then I won another scholarship, and I went to Reigate School of Art and Design. And on the course, we did calligraphy, heraldic painting, and gilding. That was the name of the course. So it was a 2-year course under Gaynor Goff and Gerald Minot. We had visiting lecturers that came in and taught different things like sign writing. We did work on glass, on stone. I did tapestry weaving.
Wow.
I know I had to set up my little station, and I had everything. I had this little machine that you would sort of run the shuttle back and forth through. Wow. I did this little textualis quadrata N. It was crazy. My little loom. And I got to try engraving with a burin, etching with dry point. And I did everything I could at this traditional old art school. And one of the things that was part of the course was heraldic painting. And so you learned to paint coats of arms. And that was a big part of the course because a lot of English signs had heraldry on it. And so we had to learn the conventions of heraldry, which really come through English heraldry, which really come through the Norman French. So you had to learn all these old French terms like or for gold and gules for red and just argent for silver. And then you had to learn to read the blasoning, which is you could look at a shield with the devices on it and you could read it into text. So if you have a shield, and then you have an upside down V, that's called chevron. And if you divided it into smaller V's, you would have chevronels. And the background of the shield or the field is a color. So if it's gules, it's red. And then if you have these types of birds that are stylized birds called martlets, if you have 3 martlets in gold on the red field with a chevron, you would say per chevron, and then it's usually a metal or gold. On a red field, on a field gules, red field, 3 martlets, 2 in chief, so 2 at the top, respectant, facing each other, and 1 in base. And so you learned this blasoning, which was amazing, really quite crazy, and just so medieval. And at the same time we were learning, we could specialize. I decided to specialize in historical materials and techniques, and I wanted to learn to prepare vellum, make gold paint out of gold leaf and grind pigments and cut quills and make iron gall ink. And this sort of craft side of it, the artisanal side of it was really fascinating for me. And that became my focus through the art school.
And that, did you say blasoning?
Yes.
It sounds like it's sort of tapping into that hieroglyphic pictorial kind of way of communicating meaning that isn't, as you said earlier, isn't this sort of Latin text or, using an alphabet system or anything. So it's so interesting that all of these dots are kind of connecting in your own journey.
And this was the great thing about Reading. James Mosley was absolutely phenomenal as a lecturer. He's one of the most learned people I've ever met. His knowledge of fonts and the history of type and his ability to connect things. And, in Trinidad, I just read so much, and I had all these little bits of information in my mind. And during every Saturday during James's lectures, I would be like, oh my gosh. And he would go, and he would say, what? I was like, oh, this does this, and this connects to this. And he goes, yes. And the other students would be like, this guy is crazy.
You're the dream student. You're helping him.
I had a great time in that class. James took thousands of little bits of disparate information and strung them into seamlessly connected lines. And it changed my life. It really changed my perception. And it was, of course, on that course, I met Michael Harvey, who has since passed away, who is an amazing letter cutter and a letterer. Michael hated being called a calligrapher.
Is that not a good term for someone?
Well, he was not a calligrapher. He was a letter cutter. He cut in stone. He he designed type.
Right.
And his focus was drawn letter forms.
Okay.
And Michael gave us a really interesting lecture, a series of lectures. Every other month, he would come in for 3 days, and we would learn about the practicality of writing. So he started with the Roman period, and we did some letter cutting. We did some Roman caps with large brushes to understand how serifs were formed. And then we moved into uncials, and we did some quill cutting and writing on vellum. And then the next session, we looked at the Gothic period and, Textualis Quadrata and Praciscus and Fractua and Batard and all of those Gothic scripts. And then the next session, we moved into the Renaissance period. And then we moved into the copperplate, the English round hand period, which then led into the copperplate period.
And is that sort of the chronological journey in a nutshell?
Yeah.
There's probably a lot going on in between.
That really affected me. And then Michael stopped teaching. And I'd left Reading, I'd gone to Reigate. And after Reigate, I still had money from my scholarship. So I used it to go to Birkbeck. And I studied English paleography from 600 to 1600, so manuscript reading. And then I did a year in archaeological illustration. My specialism was historical, ancient writing systems. And then I did a 12-week course in Arabic calligraphy, where I studied Kufik and Thuluth, Nusk, and Maghrebi, and some really amazing Arabic scripts. And I stayed at Birkbeck doing other things. Like I did a year-long course in Egyptian art and culture. I did a year when I went to Egypt because I did this archaeological illustration course. And I ended up in Egypt because of that. And I came back and I was so fired up. So I went back to Birkbeck and I did a year in Middle Kingdom Egyptian language and translation. So I learned to read hieroglyphs, and I was like, oh my God, it's like being 10 again. And so the course the heraldry was a really big part of the Reigate course. But going into heraldry or becoming an heraldic artist is quite specific. You really have to learn to draw. And my focus as I left art school was because I needed to make money. I needed to live.
I was going to ask this. Are you like 108 years old? Because I don't know how you've managed to fit in quite so many courses, but also when you're learning, I think there's always a slight barrier for some people around the financial side, unless you're able to have a job, but how you're traveling and learning and absorbing all of these things.
Fortunately, the first scholarship helped me quite a lot. Okay. The second scholarship was a bigger scholarship. And so it allowed me to buy tools and materials and live whilst I was at Reigate learning.
Great.
And then when I left Reigate, so remember, this was 2000.
Okay.
So I left Reigate and I graduated with the only distinction in my year. I worked like a dog because I would never have been able to do that in Trinidad. And I would never have been able to afford to study. This is one of the reasons I generally offer discounts on my courses when, sometimes when I was traveling around teaching, I would always give a full scholarship and a partial scholarship because I know how hard it is to not have money. When I was growing up, I said to Mommy, "Oh, can you buy me these nibs?" I remember in Trinidad, the exchange rate when I was growing up was 10 Trinidadian dollars to 1 British pound. So if a nib was 35 pence, it was 3.50. And I remember her doing this conversion for me. And she said, Paul, a bottle of beer is 2.50. Your nib is more than a bottle of beer. Which is, Mommy didn't drink, but it's quite a shocking conversion. And she said, "I'm really sorry, I can't afford this." I was like, "Oh, it's okay, don't worry." And, I'd read that there were quills. So I remember going down to the beach and there were all these quills all over the beach. We have turkey vultures, which are a little smaller than geese. And their end feathers, when they molt, are large enough to cut into a quill. But the quills lay on the hot sand in the hot salt water. And so they were naturally cured. So I didn't have to cure them. I gathered up all these quills and I started learning to cut quills. I cut my fingers quite badly quite a lot of times. I just learned with what I had because things were too expensive.
Yeah.
And so when I came to Reigate, I did things like I tried to make paper. Mommy nearly killed me because I nearly ruined the blender. And, I tried making vellum at home. The stink. Wow. Oh, wow. It reeked. And the things my poor mother had to put up with. I mean, seriously. I tried making ink because I remember thinking, wow, these carrots are really brightly colored. How can you get the color out of the carrots? Just crazy child. And I was lucky that my mother didn't stop me from exploring things like that. So when I came to Reigate and I had to use gouache for the first time, I always thought that, not growing up with money and not being able to afford nibs and inks and paints and paper, I always felt that was a disadvantage. But when I went to art school, I had this deeper sense and appreciation of tools and materials. I could feel why the material wasn't working because I had tried to figure this out previously, and it turned into such a huge positive for me whilst I was at art school and afterwards because I fell in love with pigment grinding. I have a whole wall of pigments over here.
It's incredible. But that curiosity has, given you so much as well, right? Because if you weren't that interested in any of this, you wouldn't have gone into such detail and experimented with things and found all these connections. It's brilliant. It's brilliant.
I'm trying to keep on track with your questions, but everything is sort of connected.
No, it's fine. It's
like
fine.
A little spider's web in my life.
It's great. We're journeying through with you. I also see your incredible posts on Instagram that we mentioned earlier. And I think recently you've been sharing some information about your course. And I want to say cadels. Cadels. What exactly are cadels?
So cadels are overlapping, interlacing geometric construct where the number of loops has to be less than the number of sharp vertices by about 40%. So if you have more than 40% loops, the cadel sort of turns into a flourish.
Okay.
And the word cadel comes from the French cadeau, which means gift. But I could tell you one thing, this is certainly not a gift for your brain. I fell in love with cadels in 1998 when I was at Reigate. And I remember I was doing some research on letters which work with Gothic scripts. And I came across this thing and I was like, what is this? And obviously I failed at doing it, but it really excited me. And over the years, every 2 or 3 times a year, I would sit down and I would go through my album. So every time I saw cadels, I would take a photocopy of it or I would have it in a book in the library. I collected a huge library. I have a massive calligraphy library. And so I know that through all those books, there are tons of cadels. And so I have masses of information on it. And every now and then I would go back to it and I would try to trace the pattern. Halfway through the tracing, the interlacing becomes really complicated and it kind of kicks you out of the tracing. You're like, oh, what's just happened? And I never really applied the time to it. So earlier this year, I did a complete overhaul on the method that I use for teaching based on my geometric proportioning system. And whilst I was doing this, I started to see some of the interlacings and I thought, this looks like a cadelic construct right here. I wonder how does this work? And so I got my cadels folder out, which had, like 600 pages of cadels. And so I started going through them, just looking at them to input them into my brain. And I started to understand that there were different systems in which to construct a cadel. And using this geometric proportioning system that I developed, I was able to separate it out into the different systems, whereby you sort of come down, go across, go up at 90 degrees, go across at 90 degrees. And how do you take that at 90, at 0 and 90, and rotate it to 45, and then compress it? So it was a really systematic approach. And what I wanted for the students was for them to not trace.
Yeah.
I wanted them to feel the pattern and understand how the lines moved. So it was really interesting sort of getting students who've studied Gothic scripts with me, like Textualis Quadrata and Fractura and Batard, to have another way to augment the script.
Because it's not, I mean, it is like its own language, isn't it? Because once they've learnt the kind of process to it, I guess there is a system to it. But are these sitting around pieces of work on pages near text? What purpose do they serve? I mean, flourishing can do all sorts of things where there are texts.
So normally they are written on the top or the bottom line.
Okay.
So the majuscules, you use them on. If you look at a block of text, the minuscules might be 3 or 4 nib widths, and the majuscules will probably be 2 or 3 times that in a normal bit of Batard.
Mm-hmm.
But when you apply cadels or cadelic constructs to the majuscules, you need to write the majuscules maybe at 6, at 5, 7, or 9 times the X height. So they become huge.
Yeah.
But they're still quite thin. And so the cadel and its geometric overlapping starts to create this focal point to attract you to something. You can add them to ascenders, and you can extend the ascender all the way up, a good sort of 7, 9 or 13 X heights above it, skipping gaps and interlacing ribbons, and then adding sort of anthropomorphic flourishes with heads and people sticking out their tongues. And the cadel sort of fits into this. It's so magical, these sort of grotesques that you find in the borders of illuminated manuscripts, starting to pepper the ascenders and descenders. And
so they become part of the letters themselves.
Yes. And they can also tell a story.
Okay.
So when you have a large initial at the beginning of the text, this is usually an historiated initial. So you have some gilding and some acanthus leaf work and some flourishing. And inside of the counter space, you'd have a little scene. And that scene is normally related to what the text is on that page. Now, you could use the cadels to tell part of the story. So the text has a sort of pictorial representation if you know what you're looking at. And it really makes storytelling quite fascinating, because the magic of the imagery is tied to the text that you're writing. And you could even do it in such a way that you could build the imagery in such a way that you're not only making it accessible to people who know something of that story. So there's so much to it. Yeah. When you delve into manuscript illumination and border decoration and sort of grotesques and arabesques and drolleries and how they start to interact with each other. The sort of paleographical side of our craft is really phenomenal. And this is something I always try to get my students to understand, because understanding how manuscripts work should influence the way that we understand how the text works.
If you're enjoying this episode and fancy supporting the podcast, you can literally buy us a coffee. Head to the link in the show notes. It's a lovely way to help keep the Life of Letters going. Thank you. Now let's get back to the episode.
So this comes back to something I was talking about earlier on with Michael Harvey. So Michael did these 4 workshops. And then when Michael stopped teaching, I remember I went somewhere and I was talking about, the history of the letters and how we go from Roman scripts into uncials, into Anglo-Saxon scripts and Northumbrian and Southumbrian scripts, which are separate from what's happening on the continent. And then we come into the Carolingian period, and then into the Romanesque period, and then into the Gothic period, and then into the Renaissance period. And somebody said, do you do this like a lecture? Do you do this like one lecture? And I was like, no. Why? Can you not do the research yourself? And people started to see I wouldn't even know where to start with this research.
Yeah.
And so I sat down and I thought, right, if Michael took 15 days across 4 sessions to do this for us, how can I consolidate this down? And so I built this lecture, a lecture demonstration. So I never showed slides because you didn't have time to talk through the slides and everything. I actually wrote the letters. So we're starting at 3,500, and we're looking at some cuneiform and some Egyptian hieroglyphs. And then around 1600 BC, we have a really good confluence point at Serabet al-Khadim, where Proto-Sinaitic develops, and out of Proto-Sinaitic, the Phoenicians take it, and they take it into the Mediterranean. And of course, the Etruscans then take it, and the Greeks take that from the Etruscans, and the Greeks then give it to the Romans, and the Romans then have 4 different scripts, major scripts, because then you have vernacular script written by the armies. And then, of course, that then ends up being Rome falls, and as Rome is falling, torches handed to the people, to the monks in Ireland, and they start with uncials, and then our bilinear scripts devolve or evolve into quadrilinear scripts. And it's at half uncials that we start developing uppercase and lowercase, which are really majuscules and minuscules. And then it was so amazing.
I want you to keep going.
Just write this for people, and
wow,
and just listen to the room get progressively quieter. And at the end of it, I would finish and I'd go, right, so that's 3,500 years in an hour. And nobody would say anything. People would just sit there. And then somebody would have to get up and go, okay, so thank you. Wow, I think we need a break. And people were like, no, I have questions. And then the questions would come, and it was really, and that came because when I left Reigate, I went to Reading, to Birkbeck, and I studied paleography. But because I also studied Egyptian hieroglyphs and cuneiform, I was able to put that into the mix. And there are other things, I mentioned earlier on about Hittite hieroglyphs and Hurrian and Elabite and Elamite. And these were all kingdoms in the Fertile Crescent, which is, sort of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. They all had writing systems. And I was fascinated with how these things were records of these old peoples and what they looked like, and then how they interacted with the Egyptians. And, like there's this place in Egypt called Amarna, and there was an Assyrian embassy in Amarna. And so they have Egyptian texts written in cuneiform on tablets. And I was like, what? And that I find that so amazing. And the archaeology of it is really quite phenomenal. So being able to talk about it and say, right, this is our writing history.
Yeah.
And I remember one of the really important things I would show is I would show an ampersand from the early Roman period. You would see people look at you and go, what? I'm like, yeah, this is an ampersand because it's et. It's a conjoined letter, it's E and T together. And then it changes its shape. And it's a ligature that's written in a simple set of strokes. And I'd go, oh, you thought the ampersand was a modern convention and, we invented it in like the 60s, right? Because it appears on the typewriters. No, it's like,
No.
2,000 years old. And people are like, what? And little things like when you take the head of an ox. This was amazing. I was giving a lecture to like 300 people at a craft symposium in Phoenix. And I ran this lecture through. I always do this because this is fascinating. And I took the head of an ox and I showed how it worked in Egyptian hieroglyphs. And then how when you take that head and you rotate it a couple times. So if you have the head, it's like an A on the side. And as you rotate it, it becomes the letter A. Because it's the A for alpu, which is a Semitic word for ox. This woman who must have been like 65, she was sitting in the front row. She swore so loudly. I was like, what is wrong with you? She went, oh my God, did I say that aloud? No, I'm so sorry. She said, wow, is this real? I said, yeah. And then I ran through a couple of letters like the N is water moving, water flowing. And all of these pictographs come from Egyptian hieroglyphs. So when we're writing, we're still writing with pictures. They're just turned into letters.
Yeah.
And I find that amazing. I love sharing that information because it helps to connect you to scribes from the past in a way that you don't recognize.
Yeah.
And sometimes when you're writing an historical script, if you are calm enough and you are in a peaceful enough place and you're not using the writing as meditation, because if you're writing and you're meditating, it's hard to concentrate on the spelling. But there's this happy overlap where you can feel the scribes of the past. You can feel it through you, stretching back into the Egyptian hieroglyphs. You can feel it. And it's so moving. It's so humbling.
Yeah.
You sit there and you go from this person that you are in this room to this micro dot on this line that you are connected to, because you are on that line as well.
I actually cannot believe how perfectly you've segued that. But your scriptorium that you kind of use on your website, which is where you share all your pre-recorded lessons and workshops, and you have just an incredible array of styles and techniques, and from italic and broad edge to Caribbean calligraphy, which I'd love to know more about, to copperplate, English roundhat, and on and on. Incredible. And many of them are free. But I also see you include calligraphy and meditation, which is amazing. So this idea that can be quite a meditative experience, that sense of finding flow when you're having to go really slowly, you're having to create and construct letters and strokes in a particular way is something that I find really fascinating. And where did this calligraphy and meditation combination kind of come from for you?
This has a really great story, and it's a very dear story to me. So every year I used to demonstrate at this thing called Art in Action. And in England, we would have, in Oxfordshire and Waterbury, we'd have thousands of artists in tents, and each tent had its own sort of subject matter. So the tent I was in was the calligraphy and illustration tent, and there'd be tons of calligraphers there, like six or eight calligraphers, and we all knew each other, and it was great because I got to see Gaynor again, who taught me for 2 years and had to put up with my craziness. And one year I learned something that she had done for me that I didn't know about. I graduated top of my class, but they didn't teach you how to make money. So that was in June. And then in July, all these letters started arriving from calligraphy guilds around the country. So, we would love you to come and teach. And I was like, this is great. Must have been about 5 or 6 years later. I learned that when I graduated, Gaynor had written to a lot of these guilds to say, this boy is amazing. You need to get him to come and teach. He has a very different perspective on teaching calligraphy. And so I remember walking over to Kena with tears in my eyes. And I said, I just learned that you had done this. She said, oh, it was nothing. You were so good at school. She said, you really drove me crazy, though. She said, but you were so inquisitive. And I was like, oh, my God, thank you so much.
Yeah.
And so I started developing this approach to writing, which was slower and more cadenced. It had this, you didn't just sort of write a stroke and you went 1, 2, 3, you went and 1. And that was part of how I wrote, because I would move the tool and stop and lift, and it was like a dance on the page. So I studied ballet in Trinidad as well, and I did acting and singing. And the singing is a big part of my life because I used to sing competitively in Trinidad. And of course, the singing tied into the way I wrote because it somehow affected the way I breathe. And so I would always tell people, remember, inhale on the upstroke and exhale on the downstroke. And then there's a little shift where the lungs have to change over to expiration. And that little space, a lot happens in that space. So when you're really learning deep meditation techniques, breathing is a really important part, in understanding how the breath works. It is fascinating, but it's intrinsically linked to the way we write. And I didn't understand what I was doing. I was allowing the writing to guide me. And I remember I was standing around, I was doing my talk, and I did the talk on the history of the alphabet. And then I would take a letter and I would run that whole letter through a sort of 2,500 year period. So people would see it evolve, and it was really great. And there was this little boy, David, who was standing there. And he stood there for 3 hours as I talked, because I broke my lecture. I had little 25-minute segments of different things. I did the history of the alphabet, then I did the letter, and then I did the Roman scripts, and then I did the Uncial scripts, and then I talked a little bit about the insular scripts, like the Southumbrian and Northumbrian scripts, which are really particular to England and Wales, England, Scotland, and Wales. And then I would talk about the Carolingian scripts into the Proto-Gothic scripts, and then the Gothic scripts. And that took a little while because there's so many scripts. So each segment was like 25 minutes. This little boy, who must have been about 11, he stood there for 3 hours, and people would come and go, and some people would stay. And this man kept staring at him and sort of tussling his hair, obviously his dad. But the look on his face, I was like, oh, something's wrong with this guy. So then the next day, David's back. I'm like, oh, hello. He said, oh, hi. I said, what's your name? He said, David. I said, you were here yesterday. He said, yeah. He said, oh, I really loved it. Thank you so much. I said, what would you like to see? He said, I'd like to see the one letter. I said, okay, we'll do a D, and you could take it home, right? So I wrote this thing, and his father was crying. This is odd. And I went off for lunch, and I saw his dad. And I said, oh, you're David's father. And this man grabbed me and started sobbing, ruined my T-shirt. I said, what's the matter? He said, David has severe attention deficit disorder. I have never seen him still for more than 5 minutes. And he stood for 3 hours. He was completely transfixed. He said, I don't know what you are doing, and I don't know what is flowing through what you are doing. He said, but God has really blessed you. And I was so moved by this. I cried so much. And I went back to the tent. And so I was much calmer, much more peaceful. And so I started talking about writing and how we should write more patiently, and we should be careful with ourselves. And just because we make a mistake, we shouldn't sort of go crazy. And I was much slower because I was also internalizing what had just happened with David and his father. And as I was writing and talking, this woman in front of me reached across and grabbed the hand of the man next to her, who she didn't know. I could see people holding each other's hands. And I looked up and people crying. And I was very emotional. And I said, are you all right? And they were like, what are you doing? This is amazing. You've really reached into my heart. What is happening? And so I started, afterwards, after Art in Action, I remember going home and thinking, what just happened? What was that about? There's obviously something to do with the way we write that connects to our heart. And so I started really doing some deep meditations and focusing on the writing and the breath and trying to understand how the breathing affects the writing. And when somebody is truly focused on you writing, how it reaches into them, it creates a feedback loop. And it allows them to instigate healing in themselves because they are now so at peace that the universe goes, I see you.
Yeah.
And touches them. And their emotions start to unravel because peace only starts from dealing with the walls that you built inside yourself. And so I really started digging into how to write. And this is one of the reasons I don't post sped up videos on my Instagram. Because the pace of the writing, that's how you reach people. That's how you help them heal.
Yeah.
That's why we do calligraphy. You talk to anybody and they'll tell you, I came to calligraphy because I was hurt or because I needed help or somehow. And I always tell people, you didn't choose this. Calligraphy called you. You had seen something as a child or, for me, it was my mother's handwriting. My great-grandfather's calligraphy, his Chinese work. And for a lot of people, they might have gotten a set as a kid or they might have seen some beautiful writing in a museum and it just grabbed them. And then life took over. And then later on in life, something happened and they needed healing. And the brain goes, do you remember that? That is calling to you now. And it grabs you because if you choose to do something, you can very easily give it up. When something chooses you, giving it up is not an option. And when you look at calligraphers, all these crazy people collecting paper under their beds, hiding, I had one woman say, when I picked up calligraphy, my husband was so happy because I wasn't wasting money on shoes. She said, but what he doesn't know is, nibs are small and I spend so much money on nibs and I can hide them. And you cannot be this obsessive about something if you chose it. You are only this obsessive about it if it chose you.
Yeah. Oh,
and the meditation, then you have to realize that how do you get from it choosing you to you connecting with it on such a deep level that it helps you to heal. And that's where the slowing down really helps. I tell students, the reason why writing slower really works is because you're giving the tool the time to do the work.
That's beautiful. Right, capture that. We're going to bottle that. That's the strap line. I mean, honestly, Paul, you talked about goosebumps all over the place. I'm feeling incredibly emotional. You've just tapped into something that really does speak to a lot of people. And I think even if you have never dabbled in calligraphy before, people understand the concept of having a tool in your hand and being able to make marks on a paper and connecting to something that is transforming in front of your eyes, bringing those connections through. The whole kind of ancestral side of it, I think, it takes it into another dimension, doesn't it? And that sort of spiritual aspect of it, which maybe not everybody has experienced, wherever they are on their journey with it. But it's definitely something that people can relate to, that idea of slowing down, that thing calling to you. I think it's absolutely fascinating and great that you've combined the two so that people can explore it if they haven't yet.
But it's now more than before, because you just mentioned, that people are on different calligraphic journeys. When I started teaching, I knew that there was this very spiritual side to the practice. This is why, I don't write swear words with beautiful script. I tried that in the past and it didn't work. There was something wrong. And what we're writing, what we are using the script for, calligraphy is a sacred thing. When you think that Bibles were written, not just Bibles, you think of every religion, there is always a formal calligraphic construct used to represent the word of God or spiritual teachings. Calligraphy is a sacred thing,
Mm.
and we have to treat it as such. This is about a holistic approach to the craft and how it helps you to become who you're meant to be.
And also, as you say, it calls to you. So those people who maybe don't have that connection or aren't ready to receive the connection, that sense of meditative flow, or really believe and trust in that process and open up to it, may not be ready to even learn or practice calligraphy. You know, the ideas popped in and
they're not
seed.
ready for their own healing.
Yeah.
And it's only when you get to the point where you're like, when you really settle into it and you're like, wow, this is, you know how many times I've been writing and I start crying.
Yeah.
I just start crying because I could feel this thing swelling in my chest. And I know that it's some emotion that has been locked away that needs, that needs help.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the slower you write, you really sort of take your time with the writing. The tools and materials get a chance to interact with each other. And then when you're writing, so I always teach of the line, there are two parts. You have a trace in the air and a mark on the page. And if you're breathing slowly and rhythmically and you're writing in cadence with the breath, you don't have to space the letters because your breath naturally spaces the letters. So spacing, which is something a lot of people struggle with, and most people fail at spacing because they are trying to do the spacing. But if they allow the breath to do the spacing will immediately sort itself out.
It's incredible, isn't it? It's incredible. We can overthink things so much. What I'm impressed is that you have got such academic knowledge and it's so theory-based, but practically and kind of emotionally intelligent around all of these, tied in and connected to all of these incredible areas of writing systems and paleography and all. I mean, we could go on for hours, couldn't we? But I wanted to touch because I feel like this is a perfect question to follow up with and bring our conversation to a close. But this series, we're exploring the theme of kind of legacy and innovation. And I just wondered, I know it's a big question, but what are you sort of hoping to see in the next few years for calligraphy or this sort of world of letters?
I was very conscious of developing a system which would help people to learn a script faster and have it more ingrained in them. The idea was more understanding rather than learning. So this developed out of people messaging me. I had hundreds of thousands of emails over a sort of 20-year period. And some of the questions that had the highest number of emails started with things like, how do you write so lightly? How are your letters so accurate? How is the spacing so perfect? So I started to think about how I write. And this is how I came up with my fourfold symmetry. And the fourfold symmetry looks at angular confinement. So we have a geometric construct which houses the letter. So you're not guessing. Then I developed elliptical confinement because we have these movements that we make as we breathe, which have to trace through the air to get to where the tool has to go to make the mark. And so I found connections with the trajectories that we move on in the air. I found connections with those that look like planets moving around a central sun. Because it's really crazy stuff. And then I look at continuous movement. If you're doing it slowly and rhythmically and you're lifting, and then different parts of the letters have different variable velocities. So I never use the word speed. I always say the pace at which you're writing. Because when students hear speed, they immediately start to think fast. And you don't want that. So this fourfold symmetry is something that I've been working on and I keep updating because I think it's a really important way to connect to the letters mechanically and then connect to them emotionally. And so I want people to recognize that there is a deeper approach to the practice. And that comes from breathing. So that's one part of my legacy. The other part of my legacy is tools. So having done calligraphy for lots of the big fashion houses, and I've done tons of weddings and made some really beautiful wedding stationery, I knew that after a certain time, I would not be able to keep addressing envelopes because of the damage it did to my hands. And so I started thinking of ways to help people not damage their hands. So I have this entirely new hold that I teach, which everybody who's learned it, I had a left-hander learn it, and he said, oh my gosh, I was going to give up, and this has changed the way I work.
Is this the holder for the nib?
No, this is the way in which you hold the pen staff.
The handhold.
And so I developed that. And then I did these videos on posture, how we sit when we write. Placement of the page. Where is the page on the desk when you're writing? Posture and position, the position of the tool in the hand. Then I did an augmented version of muscular movement and whole arm movement. And then I did my own hold. I call these prerequisites. And how do you get people to understand that there are things that you have to do before you pick up the tool? And so from there, and I knew because I was going to stop envelope addressing that I would want to make products. Because as I was addressing envelopes, I would run into problems. This doesn't work. That doesn't work. How do you make something to make it easier? And so I came up with this amazing tool called the PScribe lining template.
Yes.
Which it's the largest template that's available because it's a full sheet and it works on both A4 and US letter size. And you just drop it on the sheet and you can rule up a sheet in less than 30 seconds.
Wow.
And because of all the angles on the side, you turn it to the correct angle and it gives you the slant lines. And because there are all these holes in it, if you have it on a pad, there are anchoring tram pins that you put and you can slide it up and down the pad, right? So you're not having to sort of move. Yeah. And because of all the holes, you can tessellate up the pattern onto larger sheets. And so I'm a little bit crazy when it comes to stuff like this. And, I have new inks coming out because I've been really dissatisfied with the inks that exist because they don't do what I want them to do. So I worked with Hamburg Ink on this. And so I've been just starting to test them, and they're beautiful. I wanted a pointed nib black ink and a broad edge nib black ink because the same ink doesn't work on those two tools, and I wanted very specific things out of them. So, there are lots of other products that I'm planning. I have 60 products that I want to make because I know they will make calligraphers' lives easier. But between that and doing the classes, and, I'm really keen to leave behind a series of workshops that systematically teach you the scripts, because I don't want our historical understanding of the scripts to disappear. I want calligraphers to recognize that the learning of the history of our craft, the paleographical side of it, is a big part of our profession, and it's your responsibility to carry that tradition on. And, I remember when modern calligraphy came out, all the traditional calligraphers were up in arms about it. And I said to a lot of people, listen, you should be happy that this thing has happened because it is encouraging people to write. So what we need to do is, how do we encourage people practicing modern calligraphy to fall in love with the historical calligraphy? Because it will only help their modern calligraphy get better.
Yeah.
And that's been a tricky situation for the last sort of 15 years. I had so many modern calligraphers message me early on say, I can't improve. How is your work so sharp? Because I understand how to improve. You need to study some historical scripts, and watching people go back to them and then come back to modern calligraphy, go, oh, my work's so much better because I went and I actually studied copperplate. I really studied how to use the tool. So, I think for a lot of us, our legacy for what's going on should be to find a way to connect to the craft historically and not lose that. Because it's very easy for us to write scripts that are less demanding and not write the historical scripts. And then what's going to happen to the historical scripts? When those of us who know how to write them, when we die off, where is that information going to come from? How is the younger generation going to be able to connect to that? So that's my sort of goal.
Yeah,
sharing that.
That's the work for the next however long, next 108 years of your life, because you've already Oh my goodness, Paul, what a fascinating conversation. And I want to get into all those extra rabbit holes that we haven't covered, but I want to make sure people know how to find out more about you. So it's pascribe.com.
Yeah.
But also they can follow and connect with you on Instagram at pascribe and LinkedIn. And as always, we'll put all the links in today's show notes. But
the community as well, and the
community.
Yeah. So when you buy a full course at the scriptorium, you get access to the subscription tier, and every Wednesday from 6 to 8 GMT, we have office hours where I actually go through the homework that people post. And that's a big part of my commitment to my students, because, you can't do a course and then just abandon people.
Yeah, there's so much more to do and to learn, and to stay connected is incredibly important, and to inspire all these people. But so do you ever have a holiday?
Yeah, I have holidays. It's just when I have a holiday, I have to plan. Because we went to Mexico 2 years ago. All these messages from Mexican calligraphers. Oh, will you give us a talk? And Tim was like, you are only allowed 1 day out of our holiday. And so they set up a talk. And I went and I gave a talk to about 100 calligraphers.
So actually, you're still working. Wherever you go.
But it's not really work, is it?
It's not work when you love it like you do. No. Oh, Paul, thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure.
Thank you so much, Laura. Thank you very, very much.
Thanks for listening to The Life of Letters. If you enjoyed this episode, please follow or subscribe wherever you get your podcasts so you don't miss the rest of the series. If you can leave a quick review, that really helps the podcast reach more ears. And if you're enjoying these conversations, please consider buying us a coffee to help keep the episodes coming. All the details are in the show notes. Finally, once again, a big thank you to Speedball Arts for supporting this season and for being part of my calligraphy journey from the very start. Until next time, keep writing, keep creating, and keep celebrating the life of letters.